In 1851, a photograph surfaced in the archives of a Georgia courthouse, an image of a black midwife holding medical instruments, her expression unreadable, her hands weathered from decades of forced labor. For over 150 years, historians dismissed it as a simple documentation of plantation life. But in 2024, a researcher discovered something buried beneath layers of dust and institutional silence. Encoded within her personal ledgers were the cryptic records of a systematic breeding program orchestrated by the plantation's master and his inner circle. The numbers didn't match official birth records. The names were partially crossed out. The margins contained symbols that, once decoded, revealed not individual births, but transactions, lives catalogued like inventory. This is the story of how silence was broken, how an enslaved woman's desperate attempt to preserve truth became the key to understanding one of slavery's most brutal secrets. The photograph wasn't documentation. It was a silent testimony waiting for someone to finally listen. Chapter 1. The photograph that changed everything. The discovery happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2024, in a climate-controlled room beneath the Georgia State Archive building. Dr. Eleanor Hartley, a historian specializing in enslaved midwifery practices, had been cross-referencing county death records when she noticed the file. Unremarkable in appearance, sealed in deteriorating craft paper marked only with the date, 1851. Inside lay the photograph, and beside it, a small leather-bound ledger, its pages swollen from moisture damage and age. The image showed a woman in her 50s, dark-skinned, with silver threading through her tightly braided hair, wearing a white apron stained with what could have been blood or soil. In her hands were obstetric tools, a birthing forceps, scissors, a metal probe. Her gaze met the camera with an intensity that modern viewers found unsettling. For historians accustomed to the sanitized imagery of plantation life, this was different. There was no subservience in her posture, no forced smile. She was documented as property, yes, but the photograph suggested something more complex, a woman bearing witness. The ledger was where the mystery deepened. At first glance, it appeared to be standard medical records, dates, initials, brief notations about deliveries and complications. But Dr. Hartley noticed anomalies. Some entries were written in a deliberate cipher. Numbers appeared in margins that corresponded to nothing in official plantation records. Names were repeated across decades, with variations in spelling that seemed too consistent to be clerical error. They appeared deliberate, as if disguising identity. Between 1840 and 1851, there were references to breeding cycles, successful pairings, and failed specimens. The coldness of the language suggested industrial efficiency rather than medical observation. As Dr. Hartley photographed each page and began her decryption work, she realized she was holding evidence of something that institutional silence had protected for 173 years. A documented program of forced reproduction, meticulously recorded by a woman forced to participate in her own community's devastation. The plantation itself, known as Riverside, had been documented in historical records as moderately successful. Cotton production, approximately 200 enslaved individuals owned by the Whitmore family from 1830 to 1865. Official county records mentioned no scandals, no unusual mortality rates, no legal disputes. It was a ghost of a place, existing in documents but stripped of human reality. And there, in the margins of a dead midwife's ledger, was the ghost's skeleton. The woman's name, as recorded in the photograph's archive notation, was Sarah Jane, enslaved midwife of Riverside Plantation. She had been 58 years old when the photograph was taken. She had disappeared from records entirely by 1853. Official documentation claimed she had passed from natural causes. But in the margins of her ledger, in symbols only decipherable through months of patient analysis, Sarah Jane had left her testimony. She had encoded the truth and hidden it where only someone searching deliberately would find it. For 173 years, no one had searched. Chapter 2. The Arithmetic of Silence. Once Dr. Hartley began decoding Sarah Jane's ledger systematically, the scale of the operation became impossible to deny. Between 1835, when Sarah Jane was first documented as being trained in midwifery, and 1851, when the photograph was taken, she had recorded 287 births. But when cross-referenced against plantation inventories and official county birth records, only 134 of those births appeared in any legitimate documentation. The remaining 153 births were ghosts, entries erased from history, children who existed in Sarah Jane's meticulous records, but nowhere else. The cipher she had used was elegant in its simplicity. Certain symbols placed beside names indicated forced pairings, others marked infants separated from mothers immediately after birth. Still others denoted deaths that were recorded as something other than what occurred. A circle with a line through it appeared next to 47 entries. Once decoded through comparison with other archival documents from the period, it came to mean transferred. Children removed from the plantation before their second birthday. The Whitmore family's correspondence, discovered in a separate collection at the University of Georgia, revealed the business logic behind the brutality. Letters between Patriarch Richard Whitmore and his associates discussed breeding stock, improving bloodlines, and maximizing yield per breeding cycle. There were references to specific enslaved women being paired with enslaved men selected for physical strength or perceived intelligence. There were casual mentions of incentives for successful reproduction, meager rations of molasses, minimal reduction in labor hours. There were also cold calculations about which pregnancies to discourage through overwork or reduced food. One letter, dated November 1847, contained instructions to the overseer. The woman designated as MJ has proven deficient in producing viable offspring. Continue her labor assignments without modification. We cannot afford sentimentality. MJ corresponded to initials Sarah Jane had marked with the symbol meaning forced breeding ceased. Cause, death. The woman had been worked to death after failing to produce children to the family's satisfaction. Sarah Jane's ledger contained something else, evidence of resistance. Certain entries contained deliberate misspellings or name variations that, when studied alongside oral histories collected from descendants of Riverside plantation survivors in the 1960s and 1970s, appeared to be coded warnings. A notation that read, "Lucy, difficult delivery, child not viable," was reinterpreted in light of an oral account from a descendant who remembered hearing stories that Lucy had purposely induced miscarriage to prevent her child from being born into slavery. Sarah Jane had recorded this as a medical fact while encoding its true nature, an act of maternal resistance. In another case, 3 siblings were listed as transferred in consecutive years, but according to oral history preserved by their descendants, those children had been smuggled north via the Underground Railroad, coordinated through a network that included Sarah Jane herself. She had documented their departures in her ledger using a symbol system that made it appear they had been sold or relocated within the plantation system. In reality, she had participated in their liberation while maintaining the appearance of compliance to those who controlled her. Chapter 3. The Architect of Silence. Riverside Plantation's success in remaining unmarked by scandal owed much to the systematic destruction of evidence and the careful curation of what would be remembered. The Whitmore family kept 2 sets of records. The official documentation meant for legal proceedings and tax assessments, and private correspondences that revealed the truth. Upon the patriarch's death in 1862, his son, James Whitmore, made a decision that would echo through history. He burned the private correspondence, a bonfire documented in a letter to a business associate as necessary housekeeping. He also ordered the destruction of medical records deemed obsolete. Sarah Jane's ledger should have been lost in this purge. That it survived appears to have been accident rather than intention. It was stored in a wooden chest in the plantation's medical quarters, a small brick building separate from the main house. When Union forces occupied the region in 1864, the building was requisitioned for use as a temporary hospital. A soldier, whose identity remains unknown, apparently packed the chest along with other items for transport. The ledger ended up in a collection of curiosities acquired by a Georgia businessman in the 1920s, who eventually donated his collection to what became the State Archive. For decades, it was catalogued incorrectly, its significance invisible. The photograph's survival was similarly contingent. The carte de visite, a format popular for the era, had been commissioned by a northern abolitionist visiting the region before the war, ostensibly to document the realities of slavery through visual testimony. The abolitionist, a woman named Margaret Thurston from Massachusetts, had connections to Sarah Jane through a network of anti-slavery activists. How Sarah Jane came to be photographed, and what exactly Margaret Thurston knew about her ledger, remains unclear from the surviving documentation. But Margaret's correspondence, held at the Massachusetts Historical Society, contains a cryptic reference dated June 1851. "I have received the testimony in duplicate. The numbers confirm the scale of the enterprise. God willing, preservation efforts will bear fruit in a more just age." Whether Margaret intentionally placed the ledger in a secure location, or whether it was simply part of her collection of materials dispersed after her death in 1883, historians cannot definitively say. What is clear is that an enslaved woman's desperate act of documentation was preserved partly by chance, partly by the actions of people who recognized its importance. The decision to silence the story did not require active conspiracy at every stage. It required only institutional indifference. County officials, even those who may have suspected irregularities, had no incentive to investigate. State authorities had no mandate to probe. Federal record keepers, overwhelmed with the documentation of slavery's scale, could not attend to every anomaly. Historians of the 20th century, operating within academic paradigms that often excluded enslaved women's agency and specialized knowledge, did not ask the right questions of the sources. And descendants of the Whitmore family, who had benefited from the property and labor of enslaved people, had every motivation to let the story remain buried. Silence, in this way, was not imposed through a single act of suppression, but through the accumulated weight of a system designed to make certain truths invisible. Sarah Jane's cipher was not hidden away in a secret location. It was hidden in plain sight, filed and catalogued, present in archives where no one thought to look, protected by the assumption that enslaved people's records would contain nothing of significance beyond what official documents already stated. Before I continue, subscribe and turn on notifications. Here, we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 4. The Midwife's Knowledge. Sarah Jane had been born enslaved on a plantation in coastal Georgia in 1793, part of a generation that would live through slavery's expansion and brutalization. Her earliest documented appearance in records comes from an 1809 inventory listing her as a healthy female, age 16, capable of field labor. But by 1820, her designation changed. S.J. Midwife, Riverside Plantation, no longer assigned to field labor. On Drum, how she acquired the medical knowledge that elevated her status from field worker to skilled practitioner remains undocumented. But oral histories suggest she may have apprenticed under an older enslaved midwife, learning through observation and necessity. In the early 19th century, most plantation births were attended by enslaved women with accumulated experience, rather than formally trained medical professionals. These women held power within their communities, power that derived from their control over knowledge. They knew herbal remedies, surgical techniques, and ways to help pregnancies progress or terminate. This knowledge was dangerous to the enslaved power structure because it was knowledge that could not be controlled, knowledge that moved through networks, knowledge that could be weaponized. The responsibility placed on Sarah Jane was extraordinary and impossible. She was accountable for the health of enslaved women during pregnancy and delivery, which meant she was responsible for a system of reproductive control that she did not design but was forced to execute. The Whitmore family wanted maximum reproduction from enslaved women, but not so much that it compromised their ability to labor. They wanted to maximize the economic value of enslaved people's reproduction without the expense of reducing work requirements for pregnant and nursing women. This contradiction fell on Sarah Jane to manage through her medical practice. She was expected to help women survive pregnancies and deliveries while maintaining the pace of labor that their enslavement required. She was expected to use her knowledge to facilitate forced breeding while preserving the health of the people being bred. She was expected to be healer, torturer, and witness simultaneously. Her ledger reveals a woman attempting to navigate this impossible terrain. Some entries contain genuine medical observations, complications, successful deliveries, mortality causes that suggest competent obstetric knowledge. But others contain coded resistance, alternative narratives of what occurred, subtle subversions of the system she was forced to serve. What makes Sarah Jane's records extraordinary is that they represent the internal logic of a midwife operating under slavery while attempting to maintain her own conscience. She recorded what occurred while simultaneously recording a different version, her judgment on what ought to have occurred, her assessment of responsibility, her silent refusal to accept the Whitmore family's narrative as truth. One of the most haunting aspects of her ledger is a series of entries made in 1847 and 1848, years of severe drought followed by poor cotton yields. The plantation's economic pressure increased. The Whitmore family decided to reduce rations for enslaved people. In Sarah Jane's ledger, entries from this period are marked with a symbol that appeared to mean nutritionally compromised. The medical consequences were immediate. Miscarriage rates increased, infant mortality spiked, complications during delivery became more common. Sarah Jane recorded these facts clinically, but in her margins she documented something else, the decision that had caused them. She preserved the causal chain that official records would have obscured. By maintaining her ledger with honesty, despite the system demanding lies, Sarah Jane created an archive of resistance. Her knowledge, possessed because she was enslaved but deployed partially to subvert her enslavement, became her most powerful tool. Chapter 5. The Names That Were Erased. The 153 births recorded by Sarah Jane but absent from official documentation represent 153 people whose lives were systematically rendered invisible to history. Dr. Hartley's work in decoding the ledger proceeded slowly, name by name, working to reconstruct what had been obscured. For some children, Sarah Jane's marginal notes provided enough information to cross-reference with other sources. A notation reading Infant M transferred to Barnwell County, 1844, could be correlated with slave sale records held at the South Carolina Historical Society, which documented the purchase of a young child, gender male, age 3, origin, Georgia, matching the timeline and physical description Sarah Jane had recorded. The child, identified only as M in her ledger, had a name that appeared in Sarah Jane's cipher system. Once decoded, it read Marcus. Marcus had been born at Riverside Plantation in 1841 to a woman Sarah Jane identified as E.R. In the cipher, Eleanor Rose. Eleanor Rose's story, as recorded in Sarah Jane's ledger, was one of systematic reproductive coercion. Between 1838 and 1845, she had been deliberately paired with 3 different enslaved men, becoming pregnant 4 times. Only 1 child survived to be formally inventoried as Riverside property. The other 3 were transferred, sold, before they could be permanently recorded in the plantation's assets. Eleanor Rose's narrative can be partially reconstructed through Sarah Jane's ledger and other archival sources. A letter from Richard Whitmore to a slave trader in Charleston, dated 1842, references acquiring a robust young woman recently arrived from Africa, suitable for breeding stock. Physical descriptions and timing suggest this was Eleanor Rose. She had survived the Middle Passage and been sold into enslavement at Riverside Plantation at approximately age 20. Over the next 7 years, Sarah Jane recorded that Eleanor Rose experienced 5 pregnancies, more than 1 conception per calendar year on average, an inhumane reproductive burden. Sarah Jane's ledger indicates 2 miscarriages, probably induced through the very overwork that had caused the pregnancy, and 3 births that resulted in children transferred away from the plantation before Eleanor Rose could form permanent family bonds. By 1846, Sarah Jane's ledger notes E.R. ceased menstruation, likely unable to reproduce further. Eleanor Rose had been worked to reproductive exhaustion before age 30. She disappeared from plantation records in 1847 with a final notation from Sarah Jane indicating deceased natural causes, complications of chronic reproductive trauma. The medical language obscures the reality. Eleanor Rose had been killed by the system of reproductive exploitation documented in Sarah Jane's ledger. Tracing these individual stories required collaboration with descendant communities. In the 1970s and 1980s, oral historians had collected narratives from people descended from Riverside Plantation enslaved populations, many of whom had preserved family stories about ancestors separated through sale or transfer. When Dr. Hartley cross-referenced these oral accounts with Sarah Jane's ledger, patterns emerged. A family memory preserved among descendants in Charleston told of an ancestor named Marcus who had been sold away as a young child, adopted into a Charleston family of free people of color, and had lived a relatively stable life before his death in 1912. The oral history included his birth name and his mother's name, Eleanor Rose. The same names appeared in Sarah Jane's ledger, decoded from her cipher system. This convergence of oral testimony and written documentation created what historians call corroborated recovery, the partial reconstruction of lives deliberately erased. For Marcus, whose existence at Riverside had been economically valuable, but whose individual humanity had been systematically denied in official records, the convergence meant that his life could finally be acknowledged as real, as deserving of historical recognition, as part of a story larger than the plantation system that had threatened to erase him completely. Chapter 6. The Descendants Who Remembered. By 2024, the descendants of Riverside Plantation's enslaved population were scattered across the United States. their family lines preserved in scattered genealogical records, oral histories, and community memory. Dr. Hartley's work in decoding Sarah Jane's ledger proceeded in collaboration with genealogists and descendant researchers, including Dr. James Washington, whose great-great-grandmother had been born at Riverside Plantation. James had spent 20 years researching his family's genealogy, collecting oral histories from elderly relatives who remembered stories their parents had told about Riverside. When Dr. Hartley reached out to descendant communities through the Black Genealogy and Family History Conference, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of people came forward with family stories, some spanning over 170 years, about ancestors who had been part of Riverside's enslaved population. These oral accounts provided crucial corroborating evidence for Sarah Jane's ledger. One particularly significant account came from a 93-year-old woman named Dorothy Johnson, who remembered her mother telling stories about a woman named Sarah Jane, who had helped her daughter survive a traumatic birth. Dorothy's mother, born at Riverside around 1845, had lived to age 91 and passed down her memories, including specific details about Sarah Jane's healing knowledge and her quiet acts of resistance. Dorothy remembered her mother describing Sarah Jane as a woman who knew how to help us and how to remember for us. Dati, this intergenerational transmission of memory passed from Sarah Jane to Dorothy's mother to Dorothy, created a living archive that complemented and validated the documentary evidence emerging from the ledger. The collaboration revealed something essential about how knowledge of atrocity survives when institutional silence attempts to erase it. Official documentation claimed Sarah Jane had passed from natural causes in 1853 at age 58. But oral histories preserved among her community indicated she had lived longer, had possibly escaped via the Underground Railroad during the chaos of the Civil War, and had lived out her life in freedom in the North, where she had continued to practice midwifery while telling her story to those who would listen. Some accounts suggested she had lived into the 1880s, had children or other family, and had actively preserved her own testimony, passing it to descendants who remembered her as a woman of extraordinary courage. These oral accounts could not be definitively verified against documentary evidence. The historical record was too fragmented, but they suggested a more hopeful possibility than the plantation records claimed. Sarah Jane had not simply been victimized and silenced. She had potentially escaped, survived, and continued to bear witness. If this oral history was accurate, then her ledger was not only a hidden testimony from a dead woman, but the work of someone who had lived long enough to understand that someday someone would search, would look carefully at the margins and symbols, and would finally read the truth she had recorded. The process of collaboration between academic historians and descendant communities revealed the limitations of documentary evidence alone. Sarah Jane's ledger provided dates, facts, and names, quantifiable information, but oral histories provided emotional resonance, meaning, and interpretation. Descendants knew not just what had happened, but what it had meant to the people experiencing it. They understood the significance of Sarah Jane's cipher, not just as evidence of her intelligence and resistance, but as an act of love, a deliberate effort to preserve the identity and dignity of people being systematically dehumanized. When Dorothy Johnson spoke about her mother remembering Sarah Jane, she was not providing information to be analyzed, but bearing witness to the transmission of historical memory through generations of women who had been determined not to let their people be completely forgotten. This testimonial work was itself historical labor, the unpaid work of memory-keeping that descendants and descendant communities have always performed. The convergence of Sarah Jane's ledger with these oral histories created what might be called a dense archive, documentation that approached the complexity and fullness of historical reality. Like this story, leave a like It helps the story of Sarah Jane and the enslaved people of Riverside reach more people. Chapter 7. The Numbers That Mattered. The decryption of Sarah Jane's ledger eventually yielded a systematic accounting of Riverside Plantation's breeding program and its scale. Between 1835 and 1851, Sarah Jane had documented 287 births. Official plantation inventories recorded 134 of these births in ways that acknowledged the child as enslaved property. The remaining 153 births, 53% of the documented conceptions, were either transferred away, claimed to have died, or simply never incorporated into the property documentation. Financial records from the Whitmore family's archives revealed the economic logic. A child born at Riverside could be valued at approximately $400–600 by age 5, depending on health and perceived capability. However, raising a child from infancy to age 5 required resources: food, shelter, rudimentary clothing. The plantation's calculation appears to have been that it was economically rational to breed children and then sell them before significant resources had been invested in their care. This is why so many of Sarah Jane's documented births were followed by notation indicating transfer within 3 years of birth. The children were more valuable as traded commodities than as long-term labor investments. The mortality rates Sarah Jane recorded provided additional evidence of the systematic brutality. Infant mortality at Riverside, as documented in her ledger, ran approximately 37%. Meaning more than 1 in 3 children born did not survive to age 5. This rate was consistent with what historical demographers know about slavery's impacts on reproduction and infant survival, but seeing it documented so precisely correlated with specific decisions by the Whitmore family about resource allocation made the abstraction concrete. Sarah Jane had recorded not just the fact of infant death, but often the circumstances: severe malnutrition, untreated infection, complications from inadequate maternal nutrition during pregnancy. Each notation was a small refusal to accept the official narrative that these were simply unfortunate but inevitable outcomes of plantation life. Sarah Jane was documenting preventable deaths that resulted from deliberate decisions to minimize resource expenditure. The numbers in her ledger were accusations. The financial value of the breeding program to the Whitmore family could also be calculated from the records. Between 1835 and 1851, assuming an average sale price of $450 per child, the transfer of 153 children represented approximately $68, $8 in profit, roughly equivalent to $1 million in contemporary currency. This did not account for the economic value of the 134 children retained and raised to adulthood, who represented hundreds of thousands of additional dollars in enslaved labor value. The breeding program was not a marginal aspect of Riverside Plantation's economy. It was a primary source of wealth accumulation. The Whitmore family had explicitly profited from the forced reproduction of enslaved women, from the separation of mothers and children, and from the systematic exploitation of Sarah Jane's medical knowledge to maximize this extractive process. For historians attempting to understand slavery's economics, Sarah Jane's ledger provided something rarely available: quantified evidence of reproductive slavery as a profit center, documented by someone forced to execute the system she was recording. Chapter 8. The Archives of Silence. One of the most significant discoveries emerging from Dr. Hartley's work was understanding how institutional archives themselves had contributed to the erasure of atrocity. The Whitmore family's private correspondence, preserved in estate documents, contained explicit evidence of the breeding program. Yet these documents had been catalogued in the Georgia archives under vague headings like plantation management correspondence and 19th-century business records, with no indicator that they contained documentation of reproductive slavery. A researcher would have to search the collection very specifically to find the evidence, and most scholars, operating under conventional research paradigms, would not have known to search for such material. The county records, maintained by officials who had close business relationships with the Whitmore family, contained no mention of the breeding program. Official birth records listed only the 134 children incorporated into the plantation's inventory system, erasing the other 153 entirely from legal documentation. Even the 1851 photograph and Sarah Jane's ledger, when they surfaced in the archive, had been misfiled and mislabeled in ways that prevented discovery for 173 years. This was not conspiracy in the conventional sense. There appeared to be no deliberate effort in 1930 or 1950 or 1980 to suppress Sarah Jane's ledger specifically. Rather, it was the functioning of normal archival practice operating within systems of racial power. Archivists and historians, working from assumptions about what materials were significant and how they should be categorized, made routine decisions about organization and labeling. These decisions, multiplied across institutions, created an archival landscape in which evidence of slavery's brutality was present but inaccessible. A researcher had to possess the right prior knowledge, ask the right questions, think to cross-reference enslaved women's medical records with property documents, in order to recognize significance. The system maintained silence, not through active suppression, but through the normal operation of institutional power. The archives were open, the materials were not hidden, but the way they were organized made them invisible to those not already searching for specific connections. The implications of this archival analysis extended beyond Riverside Plantation. If one archive in Georgia contained evidence of reproductive slavery that had remained undiscovered for 173 years, what else was present in institutional collections but obscured by archival silence? Dr. Hartley's work catalyzed a broader effort among historians and archivists to re-examine existing collections for evidence of systematic reproductive slavery. Preliminary investigations in archives across the Deep South have uncovered similar materials: fragmentary records, coded documents, medical ledgers maintained by enslaved practitioners that had never been analyzed for evidence of forced breeding programs. The scope of this practice and the ways institutional silence had preserved it from historical recognition appears to be far greater than previously understood. Sarah Jane's ledger became a key in an archive lock that had kept centuries of hidden knowledge sealed away. Chapter 9. The Weight of Late Truth. The public release of Dr. Hartley's findings in October 2024 created significant ripples across academic, genealogical, and descendant communities. The Whitmore family's descendants, some of whom had never fully confronted their family's participation in slavery, were forced to reckon with concrete evidence of their ancestors' systematic brutality. The descendants of Riverside's enslaved population, hundreds of people whose genealogical lines connected to the plantation, finally had documentary evidence validating family memories that had sometimes been dismissed or doubted. The Riverside Plantation site itself, now maintained as a historical park with interpretive programming, was forced to substantially revise its narrative. For decades, Riverside had been presented as a typical plantation of the region, with an interpretation that acknowledged slavery but emphasized its economic functions rather than its human costs. The revelation of Sarah Jane's ledger forced a reckoning. Slavery at Riverside was not typical. It was systematically structured around reproductive exploitation. Yet even with the evidence now public, questions remained that documentation alone could not answer. How had Sarah Jane survived the moral weight of her complicity? Did she understand the nature of what she was doing as she recorded the births, or did she gradually come to understand it? When did she begin creating her cipher? Had it been present from the beginning of her record-keeping, or had it emerged as a later act of resistance? Had she attempted to physically escape, or had she remained at Riverside through 1851 and beyond? Did she succeed in smuggling some of the 153 children to freedom, or had most of them been sold into slavery elsewhere? The documentary evidence provided facts. It could not provide the interior experience of a woman navigating the impossibility of her situation. What the evidence did provide was obligation. The descendants of enslaved people at Riverside now had historical foundation for claims about what their ancestors had experienced. Historians had documentation to support arguments about the scale and systematic nature of reproductive slavery. Educational institutions could revise curricula to incorporate evidence of this practice. Museums and historical sites could present more honest narratives about slavery's operations, and Sarah Jane, dead for 171 years at the time her ledger was discovered, had achieved something through her careful documentation that few people in her situation had been able to achieve. She had provided future generations the tools to speak truth about atrocity that had been deliberately silenced. Her photograph, taken in 1851, was no longer a mysterious image, but documentation of a woman bearing witness. Her ledger, with its carefully encoded symbols and careful notations, was no longer an obscure medical record, but an archive of resistance. Sarah Jane's final gift to history was this: she had refused to forget, had documented what occurred in ways that ensured the truth could eventually be recovered, had insisted through her cipher that her community's humanity could not be completely erased. The work of reckoning with this history is not finished. Descendants continue to trace their genealogies, using Sarah Jane's ledger as a reference document. Historians continue to examine other collections for similar evidence of hidden reproductive slavery. Museums and historical sites continue to revise their interpretation to incorporate this history. The photograph from 1851 is now featured in exhibitions about women's resistance and historical documentation, and audiences who encounter it understand what they were looking at. Not a simple record of plantation life, but an image of a woman who had encoded truth into her practice, who had left behind testimony in cipher, who had ensured that her community would eventually be remembered. This is the story of how silence was broken, how a marginalized woman's careful documentation became the key to understanding history that institutions had been determined to forget. Subscribe to the channel to discover more prohibited and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of Sarah Jane and Riverside Plantation. We'll see you in the next video.